Hello, I'm Jamie Johnson, and this is another segment of Western Wisconsin Journal. I'm your legal and government correspondent, and today my guest is a volunteer from the Concord Coalition, Linda Henderson. Linda, welcome to the show.
Thank you, Jamie.
Now, and I won't shake your hand, which I normally do with all my guests, but I have, I think, a respiratory infection, and so we're just going to go forward with taping this. I know you offered to do it another day, but since we're here, I thought we'd go ahead and talk about something. I'd like to have our guests do most of the talking anyway, but it's a subject that I feel passionate enough about. I could have a fever of 107 and still want to talk about this subject. And but before we get to what the Concord Coalition is and what we're talking about here today, why don't you give us a little bit about your background?
Okay, I will do that. I live with my husband, Dean, outside of town, outside of Hudson, between Hudson and River Falls. And most of my career was in the financial services industry. I was a senior vice president at what now is RBC Wealth Management. And after that did some work in the MBA program at the University of Minnesota. So obviously I've had a long interest and passion for things economic, going back to my degree at UW River Falls and my master's at the U of M.
Okay, well then let's get into what's the Concord Coalition about?
The Concord Coalition is a group that was started, this is sort of the good news, bad news, I think, Jamie. They were started 20 years ago, in fact 21 years ago. So the good news is they represent commitment and know what they're doing. The bad news is that the problems are still out there, but we're looking to solve that, right?
Okay.
And it was begun primarily by three leaders. Warren Rudman, which is a name you might recognize as from the Graham-Rudman Act and his earlier efforts in a bipartisan, straightforward way to address debt and deficit issues that existed then and even more he could see coming in the future, to the extent that he was very outspoken as a Republican senator representing New Hampshire, very outspoken in Congress, and known as a...
And who is the other?
And Paul Tsongas,
okay,
who was a Democratic senator from Massachusetts and representative before that time. And then, so...
and at that time, again, putting us back 21 years, that would put us in 1992, so at the beginning of the Clinton administration, the end of the first George Bush and the first Iraq War and all of that.
Oh, you're good at this,
period.
aren't you?
So we've got, that was a setting for what the future held. And
yes.
This 1992 would have put us roughly about 7-8 years after there had been some tinkering with Social Security and by Ronald Reagan and Tip O'Neill, and they got a compromise together to try and extend retirement benefit, that retirement age a little higher, the forward, and knowing what the projections were. And so obviously it's a concern over not just the national debt, and it's also deficits. And let's talk about, we've got a slide, the very first slide has the Concord Coalition. We should mention right off the website.
Yes, I think it's a very, very robust website for anybody with an interest. You can spend 5 minutes on it. Maybe you could spend, if not 5 hours, 2 hours really boring down into things and linking to other things. But there's a lot of information there and ways that people can sign up to get regular briefings. So concordcoalition.org is a wonderful reference.
Okay, so it's www.concordcoalition.org. And it's about the national debt and deficits. Now, how did you get interested in this?
I probably, like a lot of people, had been somewhat confused and very frustrated as I tried to understand this issue. My understanding of it doesn't go back to 1992, but for a long time I had been concerned about the coming deficits and the use of deficit spending in the short term even. And I tried to educate myself about it, but I found that there was not really good information. You'd get a lot of partisan sound bites, and it was really hard to get a handle on the big issues, not just the talking points, and put it all in perspective. And one of the things that Concord Coalition and really all the credible groups who talk about this do is talk about relative percentages and percentage relative to gross domestic product. So that makes it relative and relevant and understandable.
Okay. So we have some slides, and I think slide number 2 is going to show us the history. And again, we have to distinguish the difference between deficits and debt.
Right.
Budget deficit is an annual measure of whether we collect more revenue or spend more money than we collect, rather.
That's right.
That would be a deficit.
That's exactly right. There's an annual deficit, and that those accumulate into the total debt over time, approaching $17 trillion right now.
Right.
And of course that ebbs and flows with policies and with the economic conditions. Obviously in a recession, less revenue is going to come in and more money will be expended kind of automatically.
Okay, so looking at the sustainable path, unsustainable fiscal path
Yes.
that the country's on. We've got blue and red colors here. Blue takes us up to or through about 2012?
Yes.
And so prior to that, I mean, you look at we had a very large debt compared to the GDP back when we were colonies and just starting as a country. Close to 50% because of the money that had been put into the wars. And again, that got paid down. Another big flare-up after the Civil War, which then it was getting paid down as compared to a part of the GDP. Again, the gross
Right.
domestic product, how big our economy is.
Right.
The previous largest spike, or it is the largest spike in the history, even to today's standards with today's debt, is still less fraction-wise or percentage-wise. When we look at World War II, immediately after World War II, it was running 109% as compared to the economy as a whole. It basically was our economy, was the government employing people and getting us out of the Depression. But as the private economy picked up, then we had the national debt go down as a percentage of the GDP.
Yes. And arguably our acknowledgement and willingness to pay for it, not to think we could permanently have our cake and eat it too.
And then we saw through even though we had a war, the Vietnam War in the 60s, and we had a great increase in social spending by the government by increasing the expansion of Social Security from what it was originally intended for. And despite that, we saw it going down to about 1980. And I remember that was the first year I could vote Ronald Reagan running on the danger of deficits, which the deficits at those times was $42 billion. We wish now.
Yeah, right.
And of course the economy was smaller then. But he could see the path we were on, and it was going up into the mid-90s. After the Concord Coalition is formed, these deficits are accumulating, but it took a Republican Congress and a Democratic president working together, understanding that we had to cut spending and raise revenues, and they did that, and they actually started running a surplus and brought down, we see a rather precipitous fall as far as compared to the GDP. But that was kind of the last time we saw the dip down, and now we're on another incline higher than what we were in the late 1990s.
Actually, in terms of the debt overall, but we actually ran a surplus in the late Clinton years. Perhaps you remember it was a very painful, difficult situation, but again, the President and Congress worked together, and we did run a surplus for a while, but then policies since then have changed the shorter term and the annual deficits. But even more than that, I think the Concord Coalition's focus is those longer-term issues, especially related to mandatory spending.
And I think that you bring up a very good point, Linda, because I think people look at this through a partisan prism always. You know, it's the other guy's fault. They're not raising taxes enough, or they're just not cutting spending enough. And looking at those annual deficits, when in fact we need to look at the trends and the projections and the overall accumulation, thinking long term. So let's move to slide number 3 on this short term versus long term. Why don't you tell us the difference between the two?
Well, the short term those annual or maybe 2 or 3 year kind of decisions that are drawing a lot of attention, the kinds of things, frankly, that the sequester or sequestration might address, albeit very imperfectly. But those items that are getting a lot of attention, as in how much was the right amount of stimulus, if any at all. I'm not going to opine on that. The lower revenue, of course, in a recession. Obviously, as we said before, revenue is going to go down in a recession, and there at the same time, spending will go up on those kind of income support sorts of programs. And then there were the tax cuts that obviously added to the deficit spending.
3 of them, 2001, 2003, and 2010.
Right. And then there has been a lot of talk, so I think everybody understands, about basically the unfunded wars. So those are issues that truly do impact the annual deficit and deficits through the recession, if you will. But they are not, and they are the things that seem to draw the most attention, and they're very tangible to people because we can sort of equate that with our personal budgets. But it's not the greater worry. It's not what causes that extreme spike, that red spike we saw in the last slide. It's really the mandatory longer-term spending that was the primary concern of Rudman and Tsongas and Pete Peterson, who is another founder and funder of the Concord Coalition.
Well, let's talk about those long-term drivers of U.S. debt. Mm-hmm. What are those?
Well, it's largely driven by demographics and healthcare costs escalating so very rapidly. So the four that are most important are the rapid healthcare cost growth. And that is both the inflation rate, obviously, which we know has, with a little, we hope, sustainable moderation recently, but has been shockingly high, that medical inflation rate that goes with wonderful care, I guess, and advances. But that's rapidly advancing, and
by a factor of like 2 or 3 over other inflation.
Yes. And as more people get into the retirement age and qualify for the government programs, the Medicare and off private insurance, obviously there are more people in that category, and the costs are escalating rapidly and overtaking other expenses. And so the second, obviously, is that demographic trend as people age. So more people qualify for Medicare, Medicaid, and for Medicare and for Social Security. So you've got the baby boom bulge, if you will, and then the escalating costs. And of course, in the investment business, we always talked a lot about the magic of compounding and the magic of compound interest. Well, of course, compound interest can work for good or for ill. So the longer we have these annual deficits and accumulated short-term deficits, the higher the interest cost will be, and ultimately will crowd out some other spending, because it is, I think, about 6% of the total budget now, but will be growing, the projection is, to 11% and beyond as the debt accumulates and interest rates go back to more historically typical levels. And then last, I guess this is stating the obvious, just the chronic underfunding, that business of wanting more services collectively as taxpayers than we have been willing to pay for. At least that's what our government representatives must be assuming about us.
And I like the way that you put it, because it's not necessarily an undertaxing problem. It's just that what we've tended to have with our economy and our political will is that we'd like to have the benefits, but we're not as willing to pay for them.
Right.
And it's more of a me first, and the grandchildren and the future generations can pay for that later.
Sometimes it seems like it, and that's distressing. I can tell it's distressing to you, and it's distressing to me. you know, I talked about at the beginning the obvious reasons from my education and my career as to why I'd be interested in these issues. But even more than that, I think is I'm a mother and I'm a grandmother, and I want to think I'm part of a solution, not part of a problem. And I don't want to leave this unaddressed and behind for my heirs.
Right. Now, I want to look at slide number 4 here real quickly to just give us an example of the budget, because we could spend an hour on this, but just to recap the main components or larger components of the two sides of the ledger. On the left you have revenues, and on the right we have spending. And so what we're making up in the total revenues is about 31% of just borrowed funds.
Right. So
And
that's
those are
that.
funds that are coming from where? Where are we borrowing it from?
Well, you probably know the answer to this, and probably most of your listeners do. There is some internal borrowing, but it's a security issue for some people too, that so much of it comes from abroad, and from China in particular.
Okay.
So, and the annual deficit has shrunk some as we begin to very gradually work our way out of the recession. But as we said, it's accumulated. It's still a deficit, and a large deficit, and it accumulates, and as mandatory spending ramps up, that's going to be even a larger problem.
So on the right side we have the spending and we have the different percentages, but we look at the top two that no one seems to be addressing. Well, really the top two, Social Security and healthcare.
Yes.
And that's driving nearly half. That's 46%.
Right. And as busy as this slide can be, and there's a lot in it, I kind of like it for its simplicity, that it tells me what the big issues are. There's a lot of discussion about farm policy or foreign aid, and those are important issues, and we should never waste money. Obviously, we should be collectively as careful as we can. But the big issues, and really the solutions to the problem, inevitably must deal somehow with Social Security, health care, and defense. And most all the credible recommendations, be they from the Simpson-Bowles Commission or Domenici-Rivlin or the Gang of Six or whatever you have, address painfully and sadly, but have to address those issues. And the sooner we address them, the less painful the solutions.
Well, you mentioned, excuse me again for my cold, but you know, the health care, Social Security, and what was the third one?
Well, defense is number 3.
But now with the sequestration, defense did get hit, and I know this because my brother is in the defense industry, and he has some choice words for the Congress's failure to come together to get something done, and instead these automatic cuts that were draconian in certain areas, but in these large areas didn't do anything to address Social Security
That's right.
or
It's
Medicare.
Well, window dressing, I guess, is not exactly the right term, but it's at best tactical, not strategic. What we need is a strategy to address the big future deficits driven largely by entitlements. And the sequestration or sequester is kind of backward, and the people who suffer from it are disadvantaged.
Why isn't this answer just simple? Let's just cut out waste and abuse. There's so much rampant waste and abuse in our federal government. Let's just get rid of that, and we would get a balanced budget if we did that.
Well, and of course, I'm not here, as you might suspect, not to defend waste, fraud, and abuse. I've never seen the line item on an income statement.
Yeah, I didn't see that on this right side here.
No,
for
if
spending.
only, but probably any organization, it's not just governments, can be inefficient. There's no doubting that, and there should be, and I'd like to see more effort about government efficiency. That'd be a wonderful thing. But some of it is, first of all, references I've seen would suggest perhaps that's in the low single digits, as low as 1%, but also some of what I might consider waste, fraud, and abuse, you might think was fine. Maybe I think some of what your brother or brother-in-law does qualifies for that. I don't know. So it's an eye of the beholder problem. And I think in large measure it serves as an excuse or a distraction. There's number one, the eye of the beholder. How large would it be, and could you find it, and what to do about it?
I guess your point is that tough decisions need to be made, sacrifices need to be made, and politicians, particularly the ones that are running for an office and haven't been in there, when you ask them, okay, you think we should be cutting waste, fraud, and abuse, where would you cut? You know, and they just repeat, we need to cut waste, fraud, and abuse, and they never say we need to raise the Social Security age, or we need to raise the Medicare eligibility age, or we need to put a cap on benefits or anything like that.
Right, that's right.
Well, going to the next slide, I guess, why don't you explain the mandatory spending, how it's consuming a growing share. This is quite shocking, I mean, as the years go by.
It isn't. Year after year, we're not aware of these longer-term trends, but on the right, going back to 1972, which just happens to be the time frame chosen, I think this phenomenon of the growing mandatory expenses goes back to the 60s, or that that it's a much longer trend. But these 20-year increments going backward show that in 1972, mandatory spending, like Social Security and Medicare and those kind of great society, some of those benefits and changes that came into place, consumed a little more than a third of the budget. You know, we're getting to the tipping point where in 2022, which is the end point of this slide, but far from the end point of the problem, as you know, it's closer to 2/3 mandatory spending, like those entitlement programs, if you will, and the other kinds of things, those that Congress controls and were the subject of the sequester cuts, and imprecise as they were. That's almost small potatoes, if you will. Pardon me for saying that. I mean, nothing is small in this, but again, they're not the larger issues. And of course, the other thing that happens is interest ramps up. The longer you run a deficit, the higher interest you're going to pay.
And could you explain for us, I think I know the answer, but why don't you just explain to the audience why it goes from a relatively low 7% to 14% in 92, back down to 6% in 2012, and projected to be about twice that in just 10 years.
Well, it is a combination of the spending, obviously, and the programs. We're running deficits for most all of that time, and then I think 2012, the share going down to 6% reflects to a small extent that there was some budget discipline for a short time, and so that reduced the deficits beyond or below what they might have been. But the largest factor, obviously, is that interest rates are artificially low right now. So,
did you say artificially low?
Artificially low. I mean, I'm not commenting on the policy,
right?
But it's not the market setting these rates, and it's not sustainable.
And it's certainly not consistent with history. It's
That's
historically not consistent. All right. Well, finally, then, with number 10, the factors explaining future federal spending. Because what can we do? You know, we saw the very first slide about the projections into the future, and you have people unwilling to have tough decisions be made. Nobody's talking about, you know, death panels and pulling the plug on people that are currently ill, or making those people who are 64 right now or 62 and a half and saying now you have to wait till 70 to retire.
Right.
But what are some of the things that this slide helps us explain how slight changes in policy for off into the future can help us?
Yes. Well, and this is really a picture of what I alluded to earlier when we talked about the short-term debts or deficits and the longer-term concerns, that the big issues are the demographic issues with entitlements. And you can notice that I probably to a failing am putting sort of air quotes around those entitlements, and I'd like to come back to that a minute if we have time. But anyway, the black bottom bar horizontally is basically the status quo for those programs. And I mentioned that obviously it's both the aging of the population and qualification for the entitlement programs, and the rapid health care cost, which caused such an escalation. Over time, obviously, the baby boom bubble is going to subside. So the red portion of that graph shows the effects of people reaching 65 or whatever, 65 for Medicare and qualifying for Social Security.
Plus living longer.
Yes, that's right. And beyond that, the blue, but that even levels off relatively speaking. But there's a big bulge that we're in now as people retire and qualify. And that will exist through the baby boom years. But beyond that, the rapid health care cost escalation is the number one driver of these kind of mandatory expense problems and accumulated debt.
I've known this through my business and having been on the board and saw what our firm pays for healthcare costs. And now I know with Obamacare there's going to be a big change in how that's funded, but some pretty dramatic rises to the point where now to insure a family, even with a higher deductible policy, is running in excess of $20,000. In many of those years, since '92, we've seen double-digit increases in those premiums.
I think that reference point, you see it more as a business owner. Sometimes I think it's obscured to the employees somewhat, although premiums, even employees' share goes up, and we know it's escalating. But I think that helps us to understand how the government, the Medicare and Medicaid program costs that the government pays for would be going up as well, and maybe even suggests bits of the solution. I know that Simpson and Bowles, Alan Simpson and Erskine Bowles, whom I had the pleasure of hearing speak 2 years ago, and that was something that motivated me to action and brought me to the Concord Coalition. Not that that's their organization, but it got me off the couch.
Right.
But anyway, they keep trying, and they have a revised proposal, which you could find on the Concord Coalition's website or elsewhere, that talks about the need to change health care spending over time and part of a longer-term solution. They have some solutions to address some of the Medicare costs and other discretionary costs over 10 years, and some other longer-reaching proposals for beyond that time.
Well, and you're saying beyond that time. I think at the bottom of slide 10 here, the percent of growth attributed to, and it's got year 2035 and then 2080.
Yes.
Now that
For the real
is
long-term
that's
thinkers.
long-term. But it is quite a dramatic shift, whereas healthcare is only 36% of the growth cost in 2035. Or not only, but it's still that's
It's
a
the
big
smaller
amount.
factor.
It's a smaller factor. Then it goes to 56 though by
Right.
2080.
Right. And that's to the extent we can project these things. Obviously, part of our difficulty is that it's been so hard to project healthcare costs. If I could, I wanted to mention one little insight on entitlements. I asked the Midwest director of the Concord Coalition I check in with her as I volunteer and get new information about the entitlement programs and healthcare in specific. And I think that this is an important takeaway, that caveats for different people have different situations, and there is no one typical beneficiary. But the average or typical couple retiring, a two-earner couple earning $89,000 in 2011 when somebody did the study, would have paid something like $114,000 into Medicare between the two of them. And
During their working lives.
During their working lives, and would be projected to collect in benefits, healthcare payments by the government on their behalf, $355,000.
So 3 times as much.
3 times as much. So I think when we talk about entitlements and how could you consider cutting entitlements, 2 things. obviously, I hope we've persuaded people by now, if they didn't know already, it's just too big not to address. The problem can't be solved without that. But in terms of fairness, I think maybe people my age need to get over this idea of exactly what we're entitled to. I am not entitled to a 3-for-1 payoff from the government program on health care, on Medicare. I don't
and
believe.
I think you probably could find the statistics very similar for Social Security. For those folks, like, say, my grandfather, who started working, when he was still in high school at the time of the Depression, 1933, 34, and worked his entire work life, and probably earned $7 an hour when he retired, and then lived another 35 years after, 25 years after he retired, and collected probably 3 times in Social Security what he had made during his life, but paid in much smaller fraction.
Right. I think back to one of the recent elections, or maybe it was a congressional election during the time the Affordable Care Act was being debated, and it was so comical that it kind of stood out as a soundbite when somebody in a town hall meeting or something was saying, I don't want the government involved in my health care, and I don't want the government touching my Social Security. It's like it was so much an entitlement that he'd forgotten where it came from.
Right. That is, the government is paying it, and he's probably over 65 and saying that. So do you think it's realistic, though, that politicians can solve this problem, given their inability to, we have these debt ceilings that one party will hold out over the other, and this finger pointing that goes on? Is it realistic that they'll take the action necessary to look at the long-term issues?
Ultimately, they'll have to. I'd rather they did it sooner than later, so the changes weren't so draconian. And I guess we can choose optimism. There was that time in the late 90s when we actually ran a surplus briefly.
Or in the mid-'80s when they changed Social Security.
Yes, right. It's been done before. And there is a lot to bemoan about the state of politics right now, as I don't need to tell you. But what choice do we have? I do think people have addressed it before. They will have to do it again. But is my choice to just be cynical and despair and sit on the couch and not try to be part of the solution? Or is my contribution, small as it might be, I'm not going to be Alan Simpson or Erskine Bowles or Paul Volcker, who sits on the board of Concord Coalition, even now in his 80s. But I can do a little bit of something, and if all of us do a little bit of something by learning the facts, by considering these things when we elect our representatives and holding them responsible in a meaningful way, by being willing to compromise, I have enough. I am willing to work not just for myself, but the generations who come after. There was an interesting piece that grabbed my eye in the Sunday Star Tribune by Steve Berg, and it was something about the senior discounts, almost to the point of being ridiculous and even offensive. And he took that from the discounts people get at the movie theaters or the grocery store or whatever, saying, he's apparently in this demographic and says, I'm actually better off than the younger people. And seniors came through...
Lower cost of living, right.
Yeah, seniors came through the recession better than others, with lots of asterisks for the exceptions to that. But he said, it's my deficit too. Why wouldn't I be part of the solution?
So part of it is the willingness for some self-sacrifice. But we're here talking about this, encouraging people to go to the Concord Coalition website.
Right.
And part of the uniqueness about the Concord Coalition, it is nonpartisan.
Right.
As opposed to, obviously, Simpson Bowles was bipartisan because you had people with expressed political views going forward. But I think for this issue to be solved, it's either going to require a third party to emerge to point out how this is, neither party's got the whole corner on this issue, or it's going to have to be individuals who are not coming from the extremes,
Yes.
but rather taking the moderate position and saying we need to be nonpartisan in doing
Right.
this.
I don't know when compromise got to be such a dirty word, but it requires compromise. And so I hope if people get educated through the Concord Coalition, that helps. If they write responsibly and to their congressmen and senators, that's helpful. And there's another organization called Fix the Debt.
Thank you. That's what I was just going to ask.
And that, where Concord focuses more on education, grassroots education, Fix the Debt is a bit more activist. I don't represent them as a volunteer, but I have signed up to get their news briefings, as I do with Concord. And most every week I'll hear something from Fix the Debt. So
that has partisan politicians involved, like
Yes.
the Gang of Six, I think, are members of that Fix the Debt.
and it's the follow-on to the Erskine Bowles and Alan Simpson
And there's a lot of
Commission.
CEOs, Fortune
That's
500
right.
CEOs.
That's right. The CEO of Honeywell here in our area has been a prominent leader on Fix the Debt. And
But still on the same principle that we need to put the extreme partisan positions behind and recognize that we can't tax our way out of debt or out of these future projections, and we can't spend, you know, some of those prior slides, even if we took all discretionary spending and
Yes.
said and eliminate the zero, we'd still be running a deficit and still adding to our national debt.
Right. We have to address those. And there are now so many credible, respected economists and politicians who have looked at this and come up with pretty similar conclusions. So it feels different to me from how it did a few years ago. The path might be difficult, but it's fairly clear, you know, within certain bounds. There is a surprising consensus about what needs to happen. It'd be great, too, to have tax reform to be more efficient and effective, but
But the problem is with the extreme partisan positions and that short-term focus, everyone is looking at this year or next year rather than what should be the policy 10 years from now.
Yes. I think it helps if we kind of look in the mirror and say, what do we want to be our legacy? If you get educated, you can't be ignorant anymore. I think about that old saw of ignorance is no defense legally,
Right.
if that's true or whatever. Well, I think ignorance is no defense economically. The information is out there if we want to know the facts. And then the policies around that is where reasonable people can have differences and accommodate and compromise to come to not a perfect solution, but a reasonable solution.
And so folks can still contact their congressman, which for the large part, we don't have any independent politicians in the Wisconsin or in Minnesota that I'm aware of. They have a few out east, I think.
Yes.
But still need to work through the party situation. But the big change, I think, from the mid-'80s when they last had major Social Security reform is that they took a chart, and Congress was made of at least a third moderates. And now there's virtually none left in either the House or the Senate.
Right.
They're more on the extremes.
Right.
We need to have folks voice their concern that we need to move forward in the middle.
Right. You know, I think about historically the perspective and talked about, you know, the kind of the legacy I want to leave for my children and grandchildren. I think about my parents' generation being the World War II generation being called the greatest generation. Sometimes I think uncomfortably about how my generation might go down in history.
Right.
And so I don't kid myself that I can be any big part of the solution, but couldn't we all be a small part of the solution?
Right. Well, with that, we'll maybe have you back once we've balanced the budget and fixed our debt problem. But I think that's not going to happen in the next year. But we would like to see if there's progress. And people should visit the websites. They can always Google Fix the Debt. But the ConcordCoalition.org, I just printed off, there's a recent article about how the Simpson-Bowles plan could play a vital role in
Yes.
moving towards compromise, getting past the sequestration, and getting some real long-term solutions in place.
That's right.
So thank you for bringing this to our attention, and thank you for your work as a volunteer in that organization.
Well, thank you. It's a pleasure to be here, Jamie.
Thank you, and thank you for joining us for another segment of Western Wisconsin Journal. I hope that you learned something today and that you go visit these websites and take action so that we can have a control over this country's future.